Hey there, here in front of me I have a very interesting system. This is the Ryzen Alloy 9. This mini PC is actually really surprising to me because for the specs that it has, it's a pretty competitive unit, and I've never even heard of this company before, but they actually reached out and wanted to send me this unit for a review, and I decided to take a look at it. So let's see what we actually have here. Now the specs of the system are really impressive. We're looking at a Ryzen 9 7940HS, 32 gigabytes of 5600 megatransfers, DDR5 RAM, and a 1TB SSD. Let's actually get this thing out of its packaging. The box does seem to have taken some damage during shipping, but I don't think it's going to be anything that actually damaged the system itself. Now inside this big blue box here should be pretty much everything, including the system and of course the accessories that it comes with, and I'm curious to see what exactly it's going to have in here. In particular, I really want to know what wattage the actual power supply is going to end up being, because that'll give us at least a little bit of a reference in terms of what the actual performance is going to be like here. But here at the top, it does seem we have the system in a nice little package, but I want to see what's actually in the accessories here. Specifically though, I want to see that power supply. Here we do have the box full of the cables. We do get the HDMI, we get the power cables, we get, for some reason, 2 extra, I think, rubber feet. But let's see what the wattage is of this. Okay, it does seem to be 120 watts. That's actually not bad. Okay, that means that this system here is more than likely going to be at an above 50 watt TDP. I don't know if they're going to go all the way up to 70, 80. I've seen some systems that will go all the way up there, but more than likely we are going to be at above the stock 45 watt TDP. Okay, so immediately I'm surprised by the finish of the system. It does feel like it is a metal chassis, but it has a very interesting texture to it. I don't know how else to describe it other than it feels nice to hold. It does seem to have the rubber feet at the bottom here, and it does seem to be a situation where we have to remove these to even get inside of the system, which is a huge downside for me, because you essentially have to ruin these feet just to get into your system. It's really annoying. I hate that. But overall, the actual design of this system is really nice. Interestingly enough, we actually do get this array of just 4 USB here. We do get a 2.5 gigabit NIC, and we get 2 HDMI. I would have liked to have seen a display port, but that's not too bad considering we do get the 2 USB 4s on the front. I would like to have seen a USB 4 in the back, because see, these front ones, they seem convenient and nice, but then you hook up a dock to a system like this and suddenly you've created a monstrosity, because you have this thing just dangling out from the front. It would have been so much better if it was in the back. They could have made some room pretty much just right underneath the power cable here, but in general, the overall IO is not bad at all. Now at this point, I've had a few hours to mess around with the system. I've tried a few games, installed a few benchmarks and ran those, gotten some performance numbers in general, just to get a general feel for this system itself. But in general, the actual design is just really nice. I love the construction of it. It feels really nice. I like the side ventilation here. You pretty much get it on both sides. It's very well constructed. And of course, you get the side, or rather back, exhaust over here. In general though, the lack of the top fan intake does limit the overall TDP capacity of a system like this. Almost always that's what ends up happening with these mini PCs, but we can actually jump in and take a look at the performance numbers. Immediately loading into the BIOS, it seems to actually use a similar visual interface as Minis Forum does with their BIOSes, and I think this might just be a new look that American Megatrends is going with their visual BIOSes. So this could just be a off-the-shelf kind of just generic new look, but in general it's functional enough, and you can always load back to a more traditional BIOS style if you'd like. In general, you get a decent amount of options here, and it doesn't seem like they did much to try to lock down what you can and can't do. The system does seem to default to a balanced preset, and we'll see what the actual TDP is of that. Everything here though seems to pretty much be set to auto. One thing I would change though is the fact that it seems to only allocate 2 gigabytes of memory to the iGPU. This isn't necessarily a problem in most games really, but if you bump this up to 4, it'll pretty much avoid any situations where if you try to launch a game, it might complain that you don't have enough VRAM. The reason being is that your system RAM for mini PCs like this that use APUs, while your system RAM is essentially going to also be your video RAM. It won't increase your performance in any games at all. All it will really do is just let you go past that artificial barrier. But after taking a look at everything in the BIOS, it really seems to be fully unlocked and unrestricted, and it really does seem to let you do practically whatever you want, so it's great to see. But let's actually load in and see what the default performance is like. Now, I ran Cinebench R23 on this specific system, and it did actually end up giving me the second highest single core score I've ever seen, but its multi-core score was a little bit more disappointing, actually falling behind the 7848 chassis that is from the UM780 XTX. Now, that did have a TDP of 70 watts, while this system, after running it on here, I was able to confirm with hardware info 64 that it sets a TDP of 60 watts with the balanced preset. Another thing that became pretty apparent is just how hot the system ran. We're getting very close to 90 degrees Celsius, and that means we are getting very, very close to thermal throttling. Not exactly the most ideal situation, but interestingly enough, the system itself is actually not that loud at all. Seems to be pretty quiet. Let's see what happens if we switch over to the performance preset. I'm actually very curious to see what the TDP is going to be set for that. And it seems like the performance preset actually does end up raising the TDP up to 65 watts, which is not a massive increase at all. But interestingly enough, the temperatures are actually running noticeably lower than they were before. This is Cinebench at around a similar amount of time of it running, and the temperature is noticeably lower, but it's because the system is also running noticeably louder. Not the loudest system that I've tested so far. I think the Surf 5 Max is still the one that takes the cake on that, but this is pretty close to it, so I would recommend for the vast majority of people to just run it in the balanced mode, because after running this benchmark on both settings, the gain is very, very minimal. It does end up being the best performing Zen 4 APU that I've taken a look at so far, but not by a meaningful margin at all, and the noise difference is pretty drastic. It went from being impressively quiet to distractingly annoying. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. But now moving on to the game tests themselves, here we have a very frequent flyer in terms of testing recently, and that is Helldivers 2. Just been playing so much of this game that it always feels like the perfect test to really feel out the difference between playing this on a lower end system versus a more traditional gaming desktop. And in this situation here, we actually ended up getting some pretty great performance. This is the settings that I normally test on all mini PCs, which is just the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we use the FSR upscaling at the performance preset. And in this situation, it actually ended up being a great performer, within a lot of scenarios ending up with a relatively high FPS. Now, while you go through an entire mission itself, your 1% lows might sometimes dip down. Your FPS average won't look spectacular, but it really depends on what's happening. But in general, the entire experience of playing the game was really nice. I actually ended up doing 3 missions back to back. All of them went perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. But I will say that the system does get pretty noisy at this performance preset. It does do a good job of cooling the system, but it seems like at the performance preset, it does set a pretty aggressive fan curve, and it tries to maintain good temperatures more than anything else, which is good in and of itself, except for the fact that the noise itself can be pretty annoying. But again, at the balanced preset, it's like night and day difference, and it's all just down to the fan profile that it goes with, because that 5-watt difference is not really going to make that drastic of a difference. Just in terms of the overall heat output of the system, 5 watts really isn't going to be that drastic. It literally just comes down to what the system thinks is appropriate for the fans to be doing. Ever since the next gen update came out for Fallout 4, I've been noticing that there have been a lot of inconsistencies in terms of the physics when you don't have your FPS locked at 60, and a recent update kind of just has forced the game to only run at 60 for me. So I don't know if this has been a fix for those weird physics issues that were happening before, but it doesn't really matter here. The game, for some reason, defaulted to the ultra graphics settings, and I would say that for the most part, it's actually pretty playable like this. I would actually recommend that you go for the high settings instead of ultra, but even with the ultra settings, it's still pretty playable. It's not a 60 FPS gaming experience, but we're not far from it either. And in general, it's really really enjoyable, and I have not been seeing any of those physics issues and game speed issues that have been happening because of the unlocked FPS. So I guess this has been just a compromise here. For the most part, I'm at least happy with it. So just take my advice and go with the high setting instead. You don't really need to go with ultra. Now, the next game that I actually decided to take a look at is not even really a game itself. It's actually the new standalone benchmark for Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail, the newest expansion that is set to come out later this year for Final Fantasy XIV, that is supposed to come with some pretty major graphical overhauls. And these improvements are going to affect the performance of this title on lower end hardware in particular. Now, I did get a little ambitious and decided to try this out with the high laptop graphics preset. There are a few differences between it and the desktop high graphics preset, but in general, this actually ended up producing a decent enough result where even the game itself is saying that it is a passable experience. And considering that this is an MMO, the FPS that you get is actually more than adequate enough, and I'm actually really glad to see that, since you're going to be able to fully enjoy the new graphical improvements. Now, the last game that I want to cover today is, of course, a great performer on so many systems. It is, of course, Rainbow Six Siege, a game that at this point has been out for so long and has been so optimized that it's very similar to Valorant, where it actually ends up being more of a CPU test more than anything else. Even here with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR, but this is FSR at the ultra quality preset. We're kind of in a situation where, if you'll see, the GPU is not at 100% load. We're actually kind of CPU limited here. The GPU itself doesn't really have much to do. So what that means is, of course, we have some headroom to turn some things up, but I kind of want to do the opposite. Instead of just disabling FSR and going full resolution, I'm going to use FSR at the performance preset because I want to put as much of the gaming load onto the CPU as possible. And so FSR at the performance preset is pretty much running at half the resolution of 1080p, and that pretty much ends up giving us some pretty insane frame rates. You'll see that in a lot of sections that GPU is not really doing all that much. Now, whether or not you'd actually play like this is really up to you. It all depends on what you can handle in terms of FSR settings. But it is more impressive than anything to see that the CPU in here is powerful enough to produce these really, really high frame rates. So that does mean that a system like this is capable of pairing with an eGPU that could give you some pretty nice performance uplifts. So after that little preview there, what do I think of the Alloy 9? Well, I really like it. I actually love the design of the system itself. It is a gorgeous looking system while also feeling incredible in the hand. And I know you're never going to hold this thing. It's just going to sit at your computer. But I just love the finish of it. I really like the design. I'm really impressed by the balance preset. I think that the balance preset is going to be the underappreciated part here because it seems to prioritize noise more than anything else, but it still did a decent enough job where an intensive workload, it still kept the temperatures at a level that it wasn't really thermal throttling. While the performance preset really seemed to try to go for the lowest temperatures possible in a very conservative way of just trying to not even potentially risk a situation of overheating. I guess the part where the system really suffers in is it's just too cautious in terms of its temperature. It might have been better if they had the top fan open, of course, where we could get the full ventilation, because bottom ventilation really is kind of a problem, or rather bottom intake is kind of a problem because of the fact that you're being obstructed by whatever the surface it's on is, as opposed to when it's in the top, it can kind of just suck in as much fresh, cool air as it wants. It really doesn't have to fight against a completely solid, flat surface underneath it, obstructing any kind of air and kind of just forcing it to try to suck in as much air as it can from the sides in what is maybe a few millimeters worth of height. In general, though, I am a huge fan of this system. We are going to be doing more testing with this, so there is going to be a 25 game test video with this specific system. We're going to be taking a look at a wide assortment of different games just to get a rundown on how this runs. But I do want you to let me know down below whether I should use the balanced or the performance preset. I don't think it's really going to affect the numbers all that drastically, but it might affect the sound. So let me know if you want to see a comparison there, or if you'd want to see a comparison video between the balanced and the performance preset side by side. But I'll catch you guys in the next one.